Hello, BookTube. This is day 3 of Boldly Go-vember, a great, very loose read-along that was created by Matt at Paperback Junkie, where, to qualify, all you have to do in the month of November is read one Star Trek book of any kind. That's it. That's the easiest flippin' Star Trek read-along you'll ever do for Boldly Go-vember. And, of course, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, so I also read an enormous amount and have read a lot of Star Trek. So I thought I might do more than just the one book in the month. So today we're doing a landmark Star Trek novel, Star Trek: The Motion Picture by Gene Roddenberry, the only Star Trek novel written by Star Trek's creator. This obviously is a companion to the movie from 1979. Which might go a little way to explain why it has one of the dumbest book titles any book has ever had. The title of this book is Star Trek: The Motion Picture. This is not a motion picture. This is a book. This is like calling a book The Rainbow in Your Backyard or Your Grandmother's Silverware. I have no idea why, in the flurry of preparation as this thing was being put to press, it wasn't given a title. But one way or another, this is not, strictly speaking, a novelization of the movie. It is a book version of the movie, but it's very different in a lot of ways. And we start off with a difference right away. A plot device that Gene Roddenberry introduces right at the beginning. James Kirk is in a library. It's 3 years after the end of the Enterprise's first 5-year mission into outer space. The crew has scattered to the winds. They're not together anymore. The ship is in space dock, as it is massively refitted. And as the story begins, Jim Kirk gets a bulletin from Starfleet, not on a computer, but on a device implanted in his head. There's a device he has in his head through which Starfleet can transmit high-priority emergency data, including images and information, directly into his head. We're told that he did not like the feeling of it, and knowing that it came from a device implanted inside his brain made it even more annoying. One would think. Something of an understatement. As was the custom in Starfleet, indeed it was a requirement. He had been implanted with a senseiver on receiving his first command. So here in this 1979 novel, Gene Roddenberry is telling us that Jim Kirk, all through the adventures of the Enterprise that we saw on TV, had this thing inside his head that would allow Starfleet to send him direct information. Of course, that's not borne out by the events of many an original episode, but on top of that, it's also downright freakish. It is this book contains footnotes. It's a device that wasn't often imitated in later Star Trek novels, which is too bad because Star Trek has such a complex and long and rich history that I could easily imagine a Star Trek novel that made use of lavish footnotes and did it really well. In this case, Roddenberry tires of the gimmick fairly soon and stops doing it. But one of the footnotes is, at the time of these events, Starfleet Command senseiver implants were still being kept secret. Undoubtedly, the Admiralty was concerned that the public might mistakenly believe them to be some sort of mind control device, and of course, that's what they could be. That's what they are. Clearly, public respect for Starfleet would have been seriously imperiled by anything reminiscent of the horrors that grew out of the politicization of the behavior control implants and which led to the bloody mind control revolts of 2043 to 2047. Anyway, leaving aside that incredibly disturbing addition to Star Trek, which has never been used since, as far as I know. It was never even vaguely hinted at before. It's just a Roddenberry brainchild. Kirk learns from that transmission that an enormous cloud of destructive energy has encountered Klingon warships and swallowed them whole, and is headed to Earth. And he also learns, as he investigates, as he connects with Starfleet Command, he learns that the admiral in charge of Starfleet. What is it, baby? What is it? Huh? Oh. What is it? Oh. What is it, baby? What's on your mind? He learns that that the admiral in charge of Starfleet, there's only one ship. The thing is moving so fast and is already so close to Federation space. There's only one ship that's even remotely in range to go and see what this is and maybe deal with it. And that ship is the Enterprise, even though the Enterprise is being refitted. And because the Enterprise is not quite ready, hasn't had field testing yet with any of its new equipment, the admiral in charge of Starfleet decides to to increase the chances of its effectiveness. He will reassemble the old crew, as many of them as he can, into bridge positions, into officer positions, because they're used to working with each other. And that, apparently, is the only purpose of this whole bulletin, is to alert Kirk that that's happening, not to invite him to take command. The Enterprise is under the command of Captain Will Decker, who was a protege of Kirk's and was recommended for the job by Kirk. Kirk has been at an Admiralty desk job for 2 years. Nevertheless, once Kirk learns that there's a danger, and once he learns that his old crew is being sent to face it, he goes to this admiral and insists on taking command of the Enterprise himself, citing his long experience with the unknown in the deep reaches of space, which Will Decker does not have. And he's told, all right, well, if you're absolutely sure that your personal motivations aren't getting in the way, then go right ahead. And he does. He takes command of the Enterprise. He demotes Will Decker to first officer and science officer. And the reason that he needs the science officer is twofold. One, his legendary science officer, Commander Spock, has retired to Vulcan, to his homeworld of Vulcan, which in this novel, again, alone in all of Star Trek continuity, we're told has 2 sons. In order to undergo the Kolinar ritual, which will purge all emotions and make him a creature of pure logic. So he's not available for the job. And the Vulcan science officer that Kirk sort of shepherds into the position, recommends for the position, Commander Sonak, is killed at the beginning of this novel in a freak transporter accident, alongside fellow admiral of Kirk's, who was also his lover and his colleague, and something of a handler. He comes very belatedly to realize that she was used by the Admiralty to handle him, to make the transition from field life to desk life more palatable for him. They both die in a transporter accident, so temporarily Decker is also a science officer. He's more familiar with the systems of this new ship than Kirk is by a wide margin. And the other person that's missing from the equation, and the person who should be the third face on this cover, is Dr. McCoy, who has resigned from Starfleet in protest at Kirk being moved to an Admiralty, to a desk job. According to this book, McCoy went to the Admiralty and said, look, I have all the psychological information on this individual that anyone could possibly have, and I also know him. And I'm telling you, if you take him out of the line of action, he will start to die on the inside. This will be extremely bad for him mentally. And when his urgings were ignored, he resigned from Starfleet. But he is politely requested to come back into action on board the Enterprise. And Kirk is happy to have him. Tells him, I badly need you, which is the kind of thing that Jim Kirk, the classic Jim Kirk, would always feel but never say. So you have to know that the stakes are high. But they reassemble a crew. All of the crew has had upgrades in their command status. Nurse Chapel is now an MD. Chekhov and Sulu and Uhura have all been upped in rank and are all seen, really, by the time this book begins, they're seen as seasoned, nearly legendary figures. Some people whose career paths are well established now. They will not have trouble. They came back from an historic 5-year Starship mission in deep space with glowing accommodations all around. They all, except a reassignment to this Enterprise in order to deal with this catastrophe. And we also have a new crew member, Lieutenant Ilea, who is a Deltan, a species that is extremely sensual and emits pheromones that can drive sexually immature species mad with desire. She has taken an oath of celibacy. She is safe to work with humans. And she was once the lover of Will Decker. And the ship is getting ready. It's pounding itself together. It's fixing the transporter, obviously. It's getting ready to ship out almost immediately. But before it does, right before it ships out, we have some wonderful scenes in this book. Like, for instance, there's a wonderful scene here that Roddenberry captures really well, and it's also a beautiful, beautiful sequence in the movie. And that is a scene where, after so much time, Scotty, the engineer of the Enterprise, brings Kirk back to his ship, to the ship that means everything to him, to the ship that is synonymous with his name and fame. And it's she hung there inside the lacy filigree of the orbital dry dock, Enterprise. Montgomery Scott, with some unexpected flair for drama, had maneuvered to keep the starship from Kirk's sight until the last possible moment. Then he had used the lateral thruster to nudge their travel pod into a sweeping turn, bringing Enterprise into glorious full view. Kirk's eyes saw only her. It was as if the delicate latticework structure around the starship did not exist, or, if he was aware of the dry dock at all, he saw it and its lights as bejeweled space sculpture existing only to frame and highlight the new symmetry and beauty of the Enterprise. The dramatic impact was heightened by the light which flooded her from every angle within the huge orbital dock, seemingly doubly brilliant against the velvet blackness of space beyond. Kirk had, of course, seen some of her new lines before, but only at a midpoint in renovation. She was complete now, gracefully whole. Kirk searched for some phrase, some description that expressed what he was feeling. Was she like a lovely woman? No, at this moment she was more than that to him. A fable? A myth, come alive. Yes, that was it. She was as Aphrodite must have been when Zeus first raised her up from the sea, naked and shockingly beautiful. Raised up who, sir? It was Scott, giving him a puzzled look. Kirk realized he must have said some part of it aloud. A wonderful moment that captures that the Enterprise has always been more than just a ship to Jim Kirk. But after initial mishaps with the engines and with Kirk's inexperience with the new design of his own ship, they get underway and are intercepted at the very last minute before they leave close Earth orbit by a long-range shuttle carrying one passenger. And that passenger is Mr. Spock, whose mind has been touched on the distant planet Vulcan by some awareness of this cloud, which is clearly not only mechanical, or more than that. It reaches out to him, and he feels that it holds some answers that he is seeking to the balance between emotion and logic. And he knows that the best way to get that will be to go and see the thing, and that requires the Enterprise. So he goes to the Enterprise, takes an extravagant effort to get to the Enterprise en route, and offer his services as Starfleet, as a science officer, to reactivate his commission and join the crew of the Enterprise. But keep in mind, this is a Spock very different from the one that we remember from the first voyage, from the 5-year voyage of the Star Trek Enterprise. This is a Spock who has tried his hardest to root out and destroy his human emotions, his human side. And yes, he's left the Kolinahr ritual unfulfilled, but he's still very much in that mode, and has no interest in hale and well-met, reunions with his colleagues. Roddenberry puts it really well in the chapter where Spock comes back on board the bridge. He had the look of fasting, of hot winds and blowing sands, and of difficult and painful disciplines mastered. He had the look of almost serenity. It was of serenity so nearly achieved that it had left behind this dignity at least. Spock might have need of this dignity, for there was no serenity in his eyes. And he spurns the welcome home attempts of Kirk and McCoy and Nurse Chapel, and asks if he can go straight to engineering to fix the ship's problems. And he does, and there's a scene with him and Chief Engineer Montgomery Scott that I want to read a chunk of, because of course we see nothing like it in the movie, and yet it's perfectly in character. It's perfectly in character for the scene, for the moment here. "It should be possible to proceed without me now," said Spock to the chief engineer. "Aye, we can manage from here." His Highland burr showed a twist of annoyance. "But we'll miss the sound of your sweet laughter." Spock ignored this as completely as he had the engineer's outstretched hand 2 hours ago. Scott fought back an impulse to hurl some earthly obscenity after the departing Vulcan. Damn Spock. Montgomery Scott was not accustomed to being ignored, especially not here in his own domain. But what a fine engineer the Vulcan would have made. That should indeed have been his calling. No one expects pleasant temperament from an engineer. Accustomed as he was to Spock's powers of logic, Scott had been deeply impressed this time. After an hour at the engineering console, Spock shut down the computers which had been providing him with simulator formulas and engine data. Then the Vulcan had seemed to look into nothingness for a dozen long minutes. Finally, without a flicker of expression, he had proposed an intermix formula which the computer tests had shown to be within a hair of perfect. All that was left was to confirm it in the simulator runs which were underway. And that's amazing. In the movie, we don't get any hint of that, except that we see a wild, long-haired, berobed Spock enter the bridge. And the next we see him, he's in a Starfleet uniform with the usual bowl haircut. And the miracle that he performs is instantaneous. The ship is suddenly free of technical problems and free to move on. And it does. It does. It encounters this enormous cloud, V'ger, which sends a blindingly bright energy probe on board the Enterprise to probe what the Enterprise is. And it kills Lieutenant Ilia in the process. And then later reconstitutes her as a probe of herself, a probe in her image. Only it's not just in her image, it's also using her brain engrams and her personality profile and whatnot. It is a simulation of Lieutenant Ilia, whose physical body was destroyed, but who was sort of uploaded into a probe body that returns to the Enterprise and tells them all about V'ger, this cloud that has been growing and that is coming to Earth to seek its creator, to seek its ultimate validation. In other words, as the book progresses, it turns out that V'ger is on a quest very similar to Spock's in many ways. And Spock wants very much to know more, wants very much to have contact with V'ger. And the plot goes on from there. The bitterness that Commander Decker feels about having his first command taken from him by the man who recommended him for it manifests later in the book. Those of you who have somehow not read this book and somehow not seen the original movie, I don't want to spoil anything for you, but Decker and Ilia and the Ilia probe have a destiny of their own, and it's intimately connected with the destiny of the great cloud V'ger. I went to the original movie with an old Star Trek friend of mine who is also an engineer, and it was an amazing thing. Those of you who are young will not have any idea what it's like, but when the original show ended, even those of us who loved it dearly and had met and had passed around fanzines and whatnot, purely born out of our love for the show, didn't really dream that we would ever see it again. Nothing like that had ever happened. And we certainly didn't dream that it would be a gigantic, opulent movie with the original cast back and or anything like that. And then when it did, you of course had to go and see it. You of course had to go and see it. So I did. I went to see it with an engineer friend of mine who was a bit flat-footed when it came to the niceties of human interaction. I'm trying to be delicate here. I have no idea whether he's alive or dead right now. But we were watching the movie. It was a packed house, absolutely packed. And about 20 minutes into the movie, when he'd been presented with almost no information about V'ger, he blurted out, "Hey, you know what? I bet V'ger is," and then accurately predicted what V'ger ends up being at the end of the movie. And that did not go over well with the audience that we watched it with. But the movie was it's a bloated thing, and it loses its way in its own visuals many, many times, and it doesn't do it's kind of bittersweet because it's Roddenberry at the helm here. It doesn't do a lot of what we expect Star Trek to do. It does examine, new technology and the ramifications of new discoveries and new worlds and new life forms. And the book boldly goes where no Star Trek book has gone before. The movie doesn't. The movie implies it but doesn't state it. The book actually states the part of Decker's reunion with the machine probe Ilea is extremely intimate. Nothing like it had ever happened in Star Trek before. And for it to happen at the hands of the guy who created Star Trek, it shows you that, it reminds you what you would remember from the original series, which is that Roddenberry was always willing to push the envelope. As far as he could, he always was. He was not a prude or conservative in any way. And one of the, I hesitate to use the word, but one of the climaxes of this book definitely shows that. And again, what we want when we come to Star Trek fiction, as we mentioned last time, we don't come for cutting-edge science fiction, although there is a little of it in this book, both good and bad. I don't believe, for instance, no matter what Gene Roddenberry says, I don't believe that Jim Kirk had a Borg implant in his head the whole time he was commanding the Enterprise during the original TV show. Not just because that would be a complete contradiction of the man's nature, but also because there are plenty of times in those first 3 seasons where if Kirk had access to Starfleet or they to him, they would have used it. And they didn't. They couldn't. It wasn't there. It didn't exist. I don't like it and I don't believe it. But not only in terms of that, but also in terms of what V'ger is and how the whole thing is resolved. Some of the stuff at the end of this book is utterly fascinating in the way that you want science fiction with Star Trek to be, where it's in terms of science largely hooey, but still really thought-provoking. And the other thing you come to Star Trek for is to see Star Trek done right. And you would automatically assume that if you're coming to a Star Trek novel written by the guy who created Star Trek, that would be the case. It isn't quite, but it's not Roddenberry's fault. It's largely built into the story here that we're not going to see our old characters in perfect character, because none of them are. They've all undergone radical changes. Spock, Kirk, McCoy, all the others, they haven't known each other in a while, and the big 3, Spock, Kirk, and McCoy, have all undergone massive, one might almost say, traumas. So you're not going to come to this book finding Star Trek done right in terms of normal character interaction, because our characters aren't their normal selves. And so I don't fault the book for this, but there's another thing I also don't fault this book for, but I can't not think about it when I read the book or when I see the movie. The thing that I invariably start obsessing about, that in my mind has never been done correctly, no novel has ever done it justice or even come close, is what causes this to happen? What causes these traumas in our big 3? Yes, we're told that the Admiralty wanted to retire Kirk upstairs because he was too valuable as a symbol of all that Starfleet could accomplish to risk on a second space mission where he may die. Okay, fine. And we're told that he is given a very lovely female colleague in order to help him with that transition, to sort of be the Enterprise for him. And we're told that McCoy's objections to that decision led him to resign from Starfleet. And we're told that Spock resigns from Starfleet as well in order to go to Vulcan and purge all of his human emotions. Look at those 3 things. That the Kirk we know, who was absolutely wedded to his vessel, as we see in this book, and wedded to the idea of adventure, risk is our business, that Kirk could ever be convinced to join the Admiralty and take a desk is unbelievable. It's just unbelievable in terms of the Kirk we last knew when season 3 ended, which is all we know between now and here. No fan fiction left out. That's what we know from here. That Jim Kirk would never have taken a desk assignment. He wouldn't have needed Dr. McCoy to come to his aid. And first of all, Dr. McCoy is an extremely credentialed and equally legendary deep space medical officer. His psychological urgings would not have been ignored by Starfleet unless Kirk agreed with Starfleet. So when we're told in this book that McCoy quit out of outrage because his urgings to the admiral in charge of Starfleet were ignored, the thing that's unspoken but that has to be true is that Kirk also disagreed with McCoy, which is something he wouldn't do when McCoy is offering him a studied psychological assessment of his worth or motives as a captain. How many times in the original series does McCoy bring Kirk up short and Kirk listens? And on top of that, there's Spock's loyalty to his commander. We're told over and over again in the original series that the Vulcans exemplify loyalty. And Spock says it himself in... sorry, I don't mean to get all nerdy here, but in the Ultimate Computer, Spock says that nothing can ever replace loyalty to a ship's captain. And yet, he's gone. He doesn't accompany Kirk to the Admiralty. He doesn't stay on board an Enterprise or a starship of any kind. He leaves, and he wants to purge all of his human emotions. When the Spock that we knew had achieved a relatively stable fighting peace with the two halves of his nature. In other words, the events of this book are clearly the 2 years later aftermath of some massive thing. Some massive thing, some massive story that no one has ever effectively written. There was a very weak tea sort of prequel to this book that just, it was dismissible. It was so weak, it was so tepid that it was dismissible in terms of what would get characters of this depth and strength of personality to make such major life decisions. Something had to have happened. The original 5-year mission of the Starship Enterprise had to have ended with a multi-dimensional tragedy of some kind. It had to have. And I would love it if somebody would write that story. Because this story is fun and interesting on its own. Of course, one of the variations on Star Trek that writers love to do is getting the band back together. It works really well because you get the sensation that this original crew can handle anything, and can handle a lot more than their successors could handle. That impression is certainly solidified by Star Trek The Boring Generation. But one way or another, even before then, fans love that idea of getting the band back together, which is why it happens a couple of times in Star Trek movies. And this novel, it's entertaining on its own. The footnotes are inconsistent. There's also a wash of the use of italic print that is also inconsistent. And our characters remain at one remove. They're coming together in the wake of being separated, obviously not along peaceful lines, but they don't have time to deal with it because of this massive crisis that they're encountering. And we never see them after the crisis. The book ends when the crisis ends. So we never see them sit down and say, well, now that all that's over, let's go over what actually happened between us. That never happens. So the book has its flaws. It is, in fact, unfortunately, only 3 triples out of 5. But its main flaw for me has nothing to do with it. It's not the book's fault, which is that it's only one half of a story. I never reread. I reread this book for Boldly Go-vember, and I never reread it or see the movie without thinking, okay, well, this is a great everybody getting back together story, but now I really want to know the story of what drove them apart. So that is Star Trek the Motion Picture, which is not actually a motion picture. As you can see, it's a book. And it's Gene Roddenberry's one foot in the gigantic ocean of Star Trek fiction. It's the only time we'll see him as an author, so we'll say goodbye to this book. I figured if we're going to do Boldly Go-vember about Star Trek fiction, we have to do this book. But we'll move on from here. We're going to take the bookmark out of Star Trek the Motion Picture and move on to some other book next time. And I will try to get the video underneath 15 minutes as opposed to 2 hours, which I could easily do when talking about Star Trek at any time. so because I've been along from the very beginning, and I have been a fervent, enthusiastic fan from the very beginning. Anyway, I'll wrap this up, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.